what does it look like to be at the end of your rope? I wonder if you can say that you've been at the end of your rope. Today we encounter Jesus arriving in a boat from the other side of the sea, and immediately he is bombarded with a crowd of people. But the voice that we hear is of a father worried about his ill daughter. There are all sorts of crowds pressing in around him, when all of a sudden somebody touches his cloak. Now, there would have been many people touching his cloak, many people touching him as the crowds maneuvered and wanted to be near to him, to go and journey with him to see what miracle he was going to perform next. But one particular person touches Jesus with a motive, with something more in mind, a contemplated thought, a thinking that we're told in the text that she had that said, if I just touch his cloak, I would be healed. And yes, she is healed. Immediately, the text tells us that she touches his cloak, she is healed. And Jesus is aware that power, healing power, has left him. And so he turns to those around him in the crowds and he asks, who touched my cloak? Knowing full well that the person who did would know that they were the ones, and he was the one that was wanting to have a conversation with them. It's a bit of a comic relief in that moment, because the disciples say to him, but look at all these people. There's so many people that could have touched your cloak. What are you asking? What are you expecting to happen here? But Jesus doesn't let it go. He stands there, eyeing each person. Who was it? Who could it have been? And I'm sure in that moment, the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years is afraid. She's afraid to speak out. She's afraid that he might embarrass her in front of this whole crowd of people. Afraid that she might be judged because technically she was unclean. Afraid that maybe if she owned up, Jesus would reverse what had happened to her, that he would take away that miracle. But when everybody just stands there looking around, waiting for that person to own up, she's pressured to put herself forward, to tell Jesus that it was her. David Jacobson describes the scene like this. Mark 5 verse 26 goes to great lengths to describe the woman in her long periodic sentence full of past participles. Listen. Having suffered, having spent money, having not benefited, having got worse, having heard about Jesus, and having come from behind. Then comes the long-delayed main verb. She touched Jesus' garment. She touched Jesus' garment. Having come to the end of her rope, having tried everything that was in her power, she she reaches out to Jesus. Having spent money, having consulted doctors, having gotten worse, having not benefited, she's at the end of her rope. Both of these characters, as they are so different from one another, have something in common. For Jairus is named in the text. For Jairus is a well-known person. He's a synagogue leader. For Jairus has a family. For he has resources. And the woman on the opposite, she remains unnamed in our text. She has lost everything. She doesn't have a family. She's been on the outcast of society because of her constant uncleanliness. These completely different characters are both afforded an opportunity to receive healing. The healing of the woman, and now not just the healing of Jairus' daughter, but the resurrection of her, the bringing her back to life. Do you notice that the young girl is 12 years old? She's the same age or as the woman how long she has been bleeding for. She's been bleeding for 12 years, and this young girl is 12 years old. For both of them, they have reached the end of their rope. They've tried everything that was in their control and in their power, and yet it has been unsuccessful. What about us? What about us? We live in a world that forces us, that expects us to have it all together. That we cannot be broken. We cannot be people who can't cope with life. We cannot be people who are at the end of our rope. We're expected to stand tall, to be courageous, and to have it all together. Yet sometimes, in being at the end of our rope, that is where God meets us. Where God meets us. Listen again to that verse. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and His rule. Sometimes we have to try everything. And when we've tried everything, we simply have to turn to God. We have to trust in Him, to trust in His promises to us. God is a God who keeps His promises. The promise that we would never be alone, that He walks with us in good times and in bad. And that even though we will still die, we will be raised up to life in Him. And that we would continue to be in His presence. Friends, if you are at the end of your rope now, there's only one last thing to do: to turn to Jesus. Amen.